Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you here and to be joining with my deepest uh, sky co-conspirators. Um, so we're each going to be taking about 15, 20 minutes for our respective talks. So in order to keep me on track, I made sure to write out in each slide everything I wanted to say because when it comes to teaching astrology, I have a very, very big mouth and I tend to ramble, and I don't want to take up anyone's time more than is needed or delay what my colleagues have prepared. So, with all of that said, here we go. My talk is all about the Jupiter Sun cycle, which I'm going to be going public with for the very first time in my career this summer, July, at the live Sky Astrology conference. You see and if you want more information, there's the URL down at the bottom. So this is going to be just a primer for what Sky Astrology is, why we call it that, and then focusing on just what my topic is going to be this summer. Okay, so first thing I just want to start with here is this principle that we all call the living sky. You know, too often when we look up at the sky, we see it as like a flat screen and we point and we go, oh, that means this means this. But what we're looking at is sentient. What we're looking at is alive. It is speaking to us. So in that light, some of our earliest pre-horoscope astrology ancestors, including those in Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, the Indian subcontinent, and the Far East, regularly recorded their observations of the wandering lights, the planets, by identifying which area of the sky in which they appeared to them. Thousands of years before the horoscope, which in the history of astrology is a relatively recent invention, there was humanity's sacred relationship with the living sky. The observations in communion with the sky became the bedrock of all practice across time henceforth. Today, the astrology of cycles and phases of the planets, both the cycles and phases of planets with each other and with the sun, the heliacal cycles and phases, is just as alive as back then and awaiting our engagement with them today. Much of my work in astrology, sky astrology-wise, is focused on heliacal cycles and phases. So what are they? What are these cycles? From the collective viewpoint, from that perspective, meaning collective human consciousness, heliacal cycles describe how a unique facet of consciousness in humanity is being challenged, fueled, changed, and or organized differently within a society or a culture. If we take the individual viewpoint, in other words, looking from the individual's eyes, looking out at life on planet Earth, his or her life, then heliacal cycles point to how an individual is supporting or challenging the evolution of a facet of collective consciousness. You see? So it all depends on what stance we take to understand how to delineate and understand these things called cycles and phases. Okay, then in terms of heliacal phases, now we're taking a whole cycle, let's say, for example, like the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, 20 years or so, and we break that down, we could say the opening square, from the opening square to the opposition to the waning square, and then the waning square back to conjunction. To complete the cycle, there are individual phases. What I'm speaking about here is a planet's, in our solar system, a planet's phase with the sun. Okay, so what does a planet's phase with the sun mean? What is that? Phases get their meanings from the planet's essential meanings, extended through the light, the consciousness, the commonality of the sun. So again, phases tend to mean how that planet's meanings become societalized, if you will, acculturated. What challenges the individual runs into? What ways is the individual supported when he or she tries to demonstrate that planet's meaning in her own life, her own chart, in a collective sphere rather than just at home? just with close family members or friends. And I call this a societal visibility. That's what a planet is extended through the light of the sun, a societal visibility of that area of ourselves. What we do that makes us seen, visible to others, what we may come to be known for. And I call this dharma. So a planet's phase with the sun is that planet's dharma for us. So please, it's important, I always like to remind people that it is not necessarily true that my dharma will feel good or be comfortable early on. It may actually challenge many of my self-images and my historical experience of what has worked for me in the world or not. So that in this light then, dharma is our wiring for how our deeper calling in life benefits others in synchronistic and often mysterious ways without any extra effort. We enrich, we advance, and we benefit others as society enriches, advances, and benefits us when we live our lives from our dharma, meaning from the calling forward, from the calling out of our, let's say, protections, right? Dharmic responsibility is then to become the world's foremost expert on what we are supposed to be doing with the blessing that is our life. This is a big idea, and it informs much of what I do with astrology, and I'm pretty confident I can say much of what Andrea Michelle, Gary, and Julene do with their astrology as well. Discovering more of our dharma will often contrast strongly with our self-image, what we've come to believe we should be doing, or what we believe we could never do. So, as I mentioned at the top, my topic for this evening and during the live conference in Colorado in July of 2020 is the Jupiter cycle. So here is a very, very basic look at the Jupiter cycle. You can see bottom left, Jupiter conjunct the sun, invisible. HR stands for heliacal rising. That's when Jupiter first becomes visible as a morning star. Then Jupiter will form his opening square, his waxing square with the sun as a morning star. Then he will station retrograde, achieve opposition, hit the station direct, start to go, quote, forward again, achieve his waning square with the sun, set, because now he's too close to the sun as an evening star, and then reach conjunction to complete that cycle. And of course, with the conjunction, the next cycle starts. Okay? If anyone watching here is familiar with my work on the Mars cycle and phases, or with the Saturn cycle and phases, this is the same layout. As you'll find if you come with us to the conference, there are much more intricacies here, or I should say unique qualities here to Jupiter cycle than certainly to Mars and Saturn's. Okay, so very, very briefly then, Jupiter cycle. It's 13 months long, and that's a pretty consistent number. Jupiter passes through 13 phases. So if you, let me just go back here, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 8 phases listed here, just in terms of the very, very basic astronomical or astrological events with the sun. But I've learned from looking at this with clients and notable people that, and this is also consistent with my Mars and Saturn cycle work, that there are actually 13 phases, and we're going to go through each one in detail when at the conference. And each of these phases, of course, has to have its own characteristics because it's a fundamentally different astronomical relationship Jupiter is in with the Earth at each of these various phases. Now, the cycle, in terms of Jupiter's cycle, the sign of Jupiter's cycle indicates a unique dharma. So what I'm suggesting here is that each 13-month period of Jupiter with the sun has its own astrological theme. And all the events that go on within that 13 months is under that sign quality, those sign meanings and attributions. And how we find what the sign of each cycle is you simply look at Jupiter at heliacal rise, and that sign indicates the sign of the entire cycle. Just like you and I, when we identify with our sun sign, that sun sign is when we were born. We do not identify with the sign when we were conceived 9 months prior to birth. It's the same principle here. So now getting more granular one level, in terms of Jupiter's phases, each of the phases characterizes a specific type or method of collective growth. So for example, just generically, discovery, development, challenge, integration, etc. So here's how phases in general are kind of come to be, or how I get the meaning from the phases of Jupiter with the sun. Number one, how our personal pursuit of truth, growth, and freedom, familiar Jupiter words if you're an astrologer, is contributing to society. Number two, how the current collective reality is affirming or challenging our personal pursuit of those qualities, those achievements. And number three, the phase exposes the alignment or misalignment between our personal reality and the cultural or societal reality that we're currently living in. And I'm sure you can identify with all those qualities of Jupiter. So each phase of Jupiter possesses a type of dynamic, a way of growing, a way of evolving, a way of changing. And this can be found, as I alluded to earlier, in Jupiter's astronomical relationship to the sun as we experience him on Earth. Okay. So I've coined this term several years ago called sky factors. And just like we have the chart factors, for example, a planet in a sign, in a house, in aspect, it's given, let's say, accidental dignity, its strength or weakness. These are all factors that we can find in the chart. Now, some of these factors actually come from the living sky principles. Some of them, however, do not. And so here are the sky factors. If you want to assess a planet's strength, weakness, and dynamic of growth or movement, you need to start studying the planet's, for example, Earth proximity. How far or close was the planet to Earth at the moment in question? Its latitude, and I should have written in there declination as well, that astrologers can use one or the other, or both, to delineate the planet from its sky position. The planet's relative brightness, relative magnitude, the planet's speed, relative velocity, as well as a planet's sky appearance. So I just wanted to bring in a few more ideas here that may be new to you if you are new to sky astrology or if you're new to my work. By sky appearance, I simply mean where is the planet in our skies. In the case of the outer planets, the options are morning sky, or traditionally, the options are morning star, where the planet is rising before the sun, evening star, when the planet is setting after the sun, or invisible. I have found over my years of doing this and looking at this and really being in love with this, that there's actually a fourth designation that I'm starting to incorporate, or I have been incorporating, and it seems to be taken on with those colleagues who get what I'm talking about. So morning star. The morning star Jupiter, or morning star planets, generally correlate with that planet's subjective capacities, how that planet operates as an expression of the person's uniqueness. Morning star, planet rising in the morning before the sun. And by the way, this would be a planet earlier in the zodiac than the sun. Next, the evening star planet. A planet that is evening star is a planet that is, as I mentioned, setting after the sun in the western sky, so the planet is later in the zodiac than the sun. And this is a planet, astrologically speaking, that correlates with one's collective capacities. That is, what one does and how one is received by its society, what one does within the collective or societal context, and how it is received and how the person responds or reacts to that reception. The final one that is unique to me is what I call midnight star planet. These planets, this position of the outer planets only apply to outer planets. You cannot have Venus or Mercury as a midnight star. But this is simply a planet that is visible for most of the night. That is, it is rising, the planet is rising over the eastern horizon around dusk or earlier, or maybe a bit later, when the sun is setting in the west. So if the sun is setting in the west and the planet is rising in the east around that time or a little bit after, you can tell the planet is is visibly traversing the entire sky, the entire evening, or excuse me, the entire nighttime into the next day. So where I go with this is, this correlates with an intensified effect producing an initiatory break in familiar reality. In other words, when an outer planet, which is not as intimate and personal, if you will, as the inner planets, it's not as intrinsic in our emotional, psychological wiring, some would say. When one of these outer planets is midnight star, it's visible the entire night. There's no sun to blot out its light. And when that happens, these, quote, outer capacities, especially with Jupiter being a kind of social or societal planet, a transition from inner to outer of ourselves, of our psyche. The midnight star, Jupiter, then reveals how available we are to have a break from our familiar, our own reality, our own familiar references to what is true, what is false, who I am, who I'm not. So when Jupiter is visible for that long, it tends to accelerate things, obviously, because Jupiter, that's one of the key words with Jupiter. Okay, so you'll see here. Great. The Jupiter cycle, in general then, now that we're here, correlates with how human consciousness is expanding in its consciousness, in its reach, in its understanding, through its efforts to interact with and understand more of its reality. That could be spiritual reality, that could be deep sea exploration, that could be exploration of consciousness, that could be going back and exploring history and ancestry. Whatever it is, it's like investigating in order to understand more of its reality. So the Jupiter cycle, therefore, signifies humanity's pursuit of its truth, and therefore its pursuit of freedom, to find where it is no longer needing to be bound by prior definitions. Okay? So this is kind of the way, a good way to kind of plant in you guys some key ideas, some basic ways to understand the Jupiter-Sun cycle and the phases within it. So within individuals, in other words, take a look at your natal Jupiter phase, your natal Jupiter cycle, or your progressed Jupiter phase. These personal Jupiter phases and cycles signify how your capacity to expand beyond your limits and your current definitions are directly contributing to the collective expansion beyond its own limits and definitions. See, it's a symbiotic relationship. Any planet with the sun, cycle and phases, is this symbiosis between them. Number two, where the natives' pursuit of truth and freedom is being obstructed by existing definitions of security and the familiar. And those obstructions could be coming from outside of oneself. They could also be coming from one's own unconscious, one's own shadow. Okay, so big ideas. And I hope I don't know how much time, I hope I didn't go too long, but that's my talk for tonight. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I'm gonna now hand it over to Andrea so she can start her presentation efficiently.
Hello, this is Andrea Michelle Kennedy for the Sky Astrology Conference. This is my piece on the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of December 21st, 2020. This graphic here is taken from Starry Night Pro, which is a really, really beautiful astronomy software. I wanted to highlight where the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction would be in the sky, close to which asterisms in relationship to the Sun on December 21st, 2020. Now you'll notice it says just Saturn here, but that's actually incorrect that it's just Saturn. It's just that the two planets are occulting here, and it's very, very difficult to see both of them, and the software program wouldn't allow me to put Jupiter in there as well because they would have just bumped right into each other, the names. So you just see Saturn here, but this is actually Jupiter and Saturn. So I'll be speaking a little bit about the difference between latitude versus declination, and then going into a little bit of antisha and contra-antisha. So, in short, latitude is the measurement of a planet or a body above or below the ecliptic. And as we know as astrologers, the ecliptic is the perceived path of the sun in our sky, although it is technically the Earth's path around the sun in our solar system. So a planet in north latitude, for example, would be a planet that is above the ecliptic. A planet in south latitude, of course, would be a planet in below south of the ecliptic. So it is a measurement north or south of that ecliptic. Longitude here is the equivalent east or west of the ecliptic. So latitude and longitude are both systems of measurement, either north or south, or east or west in the case of longitude, of the ecliptic. Longitude is what we are most familiar with when looking at the 2D chart wheel. Declination, on the other hand, if you want to see this graphic here on the right, is a system of measurement of planets or other bodies in relationship to the celestial equator, which is simply the Earth's equator projected into space. In this graphic, you'll see the celestial equator and the ecliptic, and where they meet up, in one place it's the spring equinox or in the northern hemisphere, or would be the autumnal equinox in the southern hemisphere, and the autumnal equinox in the northern hemisphere, which would be the vernal equinox in the southern hemisphere. So these 2 points of intersection mark the equinoxes. The points where the ecliptic and the celestial equator are farthest apart mark the solstices. So obviously in the northern hemisphere in our summer, when the sky is the highest in the sky, it is at 23 and change degrees of latitude. It is 23 degrees by declination. That means the sun is the furthest from the celestial equator as it gets. Conversely, in the wintertime, when the sun is at its southernmost point in Capricorn, it is at 23 degrees and 26 minutes south of the celestial equator. It is the furthest south that it gets. So again, declination is a measurement north or south of the celestial equator. RA here is for right ascension, which is the east-west measurement in relationship to the celestial equator, which is measured in hours and minutes. And the measurement begins at the Aries point and heads east from there. So another graph here, or at least an image that shows you in space where the celestial equator and the ecliptic come together. In those two places, again, this is in illustrating the Aries point here. This is March. It's hard to see. I know it's a little bit small here. But this would be where the celestial equator and the ecliptic meet to start the spring, or 0 Aries here. It's below the constellation of the Fishes and almost in a direct line below Schiat in the Pegasus constellation. And it's above Cetus, the sea monster, which is hard to see here. It's kind of cut off. But this gives you some idea of what it looks like. And as you can imagine, those are very powerful points, right? Where the celestial equator and the ecliptic meet, as well as the points where the sun is farthest from the celestial equator. Both north and south are also deemed very, very important points and form the basis for the measurement of shadow and light, also known as antisha and contra-antisha. So antisha, or SCIA in the Greek, is shadow. Antisha is plural, and Antishan is singular. Antisha are basically the mirror image of a sign or planet based on the axis of the Cancer-Capricorn solstitial axis here. Antisha are also known as solstice points. Contra-antisha is based on the equinoxes. So contra-antisha is the measurement of planetary strength, weakness, or I'll get more into that in a little bit, based on the equinox as the equinox points as the points of reference. As it says here in the second bullet, there's a long history of use with antisha and contra-antisha. It's not so much used terribly much today, but by the ancients it was, and there are several different ways to look at antisha and contra-antisha. It was first recorded, its use was first recorded in the 1st century, and again the use of orbs or no orbs, and the interpretation of antisha and contra-antisha has shifted and changed depending on which ancient astrologer one is reading, but the general idea is the same, and which is that it's measured by these 4 important cardinal points: the solstice axis or the equinoctial axis. The length of daylight was an important measurement for classical astrologers. It's really, again, the context in which traditional astrology was founded and based in, which is this prominence of light over dark, the emphasis of light over dark, on which the ideas of antisha and contra-antisha were founded and based. Straight and oblique rising signs have to do with the amount of time that it takes for signs to rise. Now, to make a point here, a point of emphasis, if it's not clear already, the antisha and contra-antisha is based, it's really an earth-based system of measurement because it relies on the Earth's rotation on its axis around the sun, in its revolution around the sun. It's very much based on the tropical zodiac, and again the movement of the sun from Earth perspective based on the seasons. So the measurement of the amount of time that it takes for certain signs to rise, certain astrologers gave emphasis to certain signs over others as being dominant. For example, the signs Cancer to Sagittarius have similar rising times. They rise relatively straight and take more than 2 hours before they are fully risen on the eastern horizon. Capricorn through Gemini, on the other hand, have ascension times that are shorter than 2 hours. So by some estimations, by ancient astrologers, those Capricorn through Gemini ascension time signs that are shorter than 2 hours are considered oblique and not as strong as Cancer to Sagittarius, which are all 2 hours or slightly longer in their rising times and are called the straight rising signs. Many astrologers really just used antisha to look at shadow and light play. But Ptolemy he's one of the astrologers who used the equinoxes also as a reference point. And the orbs that various astrologers used really varied. I use 1.5 degree orb for both antisha and contra-antisha because I find that works fairly well. But I think it was William Lilly who was very, very open with, he actually used pretty wide orbs and a lot of aspects, even the sextile and the trine and the square, whereas Firmicus used only the conjunction. Some keywords that we can use for antisha, or that have been used for antisha and contra-antisha, are seeing for antisha versus hearing for contra-antisha, reflection and echo, and power and sympathy. It's also important to remember that for Antisha, the planets that are in Antishan relationship with each other, as you can see on the left side of these two charts here, the left one, these planets all have the same amount of the ratio of daytime hours to nighttime hours. In contra-antisha, these planets are all, they complement one another. So in other words, we've got Taurus here, for example, and Aquarius, which the amount of daylight that Taurus has equals the amount of nighttime that Aquarius has. So there's a balancing that goes on. There's more of a likeness in Antisha and more of a balancing with contra-antisha. So this next bullet point here, this nighttime approach, to give some context, I've been very, very influenced by astrologer and psychotherapist Jason Hawley in his work with using traditional astrology and bringing it up to date, so to speak. What I believe that he's doing and what I'm also interested in is to just bring in a new or the current cultural context to definitions of traditional astrology, including Antisha and contra-antisha in my case. I don't know that Jason works with Antisha or contra-antisha. I know he works with sect, and he has a brilliant 3-part webinar series that he's doing. He's completed the first 2 of the 3. It's called Psychologizing Sect, and I highly recommend it. You can get it through Astrology University. We need to talk about cultural context here. It's important in our understanding of astrology as to why we have the systems and significations in place that we do. So the ancients really, as I mentioned before, really emphasized light. They measured the amount of daylight, and a lot of the interpretations and whether a planet was in detriment or not, or just the overall function of the chart, and whether it was positive for the individual or not, had a lot to do with the amount of daylight versus nighttime in a chart. And obviously they viewed more daylight, the solar energy, the solar power, as more positive. So if we're again looking at cultural context, we really need to see where we're at now, and if that still makes as much sense as it did back then to our forebears. In my research into cultural astrology and astronomy, which I will be also presenting at the 3rd Sky Astrology Conference, researching, for example, the Aboriginal Australian tribes, some of them actually emphasized the dark rifts and the spaces in between the stars and asterisms as very, very important, of equal importance to any of the asterisms, that these places were portals of power. And isn't that fascinating? Because again, it's bringing in this idea of the power in the dark, and not necessarily the power to mesmerize or the power to, all of the 8th house scorpionic kind of symbolisms of the dark, but really bringing back the multiplicity and the mystery of the nighttime, which scares us. We don't like to know that things, we like to have everything clear and bright and understood and rational, but the irrational and the mysterious and the, again, multivalent nature of the dark is really as important and very underused or underestimated in our cultural, as a cultural reference in general in this day and age, much less in astrology. So to bring back a nighttime approach to our astrology and to Antisha is something that I'm really, really interested in. I'm remembering too that it was the first Sky Astrology Conference where Gary was introducing his material, and he quoted Alexander Ruperti with the essential task of astrologers should be to interpret human life in terms of the needs of the epoch. Well, I guess it's my contention that one of the needs of the epoch is to really kind of balance light and dark, bring back what has been reviled or what scared us, including the aspects of our feminine nature. And again, this is not women in general. This is our feminine nature, male and women, men and women alike, and really kind of bringing in this complement of the shadow as well as the light in our delineations, in our understanding of the world, and bringing that really as part of an emphasis and a rebalancing in this day and age. So I like the word complementing versus commanding and obeying. Commanding and obeying are basically the language that the ancients used, the traditional Greek and Persian astrologers, to delineate planets that were, or in sign energies, planets that were in signs where they were stronger due to the amount of daylight or the rising times, whether it was 2 hours or more versus 2 hours or less. So it's basically, as I wrote, the interplay of shadow and light that I'm interested in, not so much the commanding and obeying. And I like the fact that antisha and contra-antisha reveal hidden relationships that would not be immediately visible based on longitude alone. Now, the square is equal, or the square aspects also show up in antisha and contra-antisha, as you can see here. So that is something that is very evident in antisha and contra-antisha, as well as the 2D chart. Now, inconjuncts also show up by longitude, but there's seemingly, quote-unquote, no relationship in an inconjunct if we're looking strictly longitudinally on a chart wheel. But we can see signs that are in quincunx, for example, aspect by longitude, like Aries and Virgo, do have relationship by antisha. They are of equal, quote-unquote, strength or power. So now, taking a look at the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction chart of December 21st, 2020, I decided to use contra-antisha versus antisha. What I like about contra-antisha is its balancing of the hemispheres. If we go back to the previous slide, and we see that Aries through Virgo would be technically the lower half of our chart, the southern hemisphere in the quote-unquote normal chart, and Libra through Pisces would be the upper hemisphere. The contra-antisha really brings forward relationship between those two hemispheres. It bridges those two hemispheres. And in this chart, there is a lot of upper hemisphere and air in where Pluto and Saturn are in this chart. So I thought the contra-antisha would be nice to find where the balancing elements are in this chart. So right off the bat, I mean, there's just so much juiciness in this chart. I use whole sign houses, but if we were looking at quadrant house system, the ascendant would still be at 0 Taurus and change, which is very powerful to me. There's a lot of feminine elements in this chart. A lot of counterbalancing of the feminine to this very dry and airy 10th house aspect of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. Not to mention there's Pallas, interestingly enough, in in Aquarius here with these two. We see Venus and Juno also in a nice sextile to these two. I'll get back to them in a minute. But we also see a partile Eris and Mars here, which are squaring Pluto. And we've got Uranus and Black Moon Lilith and the ascendant squaring this Jupiter-Saturn and Pallas conjunction up here. And all of this happening on the darkest day of the year. So there's a lot of incredible feminine power and energy. So, getting back to Venus and Juno here, if we were to just go by the inner wheel, that would be the chart of the conjunction on its own. The outer wheel is showing the contra-antisha aspects of the chart. And if you'll notice here, Venus is in contra-antisha. Again, I'm using a 1.5 degree orb. Contra-antisha to Pluto here. And Juno is in contra-antisha to Jupiter and Saturn. So, to me, this sweet sextile becomes a very potent emphasis on making sure and we keep our commitment to prioritizing care and reciprocity. So the nodes, the North Node in Gemini and Sagittarius are, of course, in Gemini and Sagittarius, no longer in Cancer and Capricorn, but we would have recently moved from Cancer and Capricorn. So this is like an echo of that really strong Cancerian and Capricorn emphasis that was especially prevalent if we look back at the beginning of this year, just recently in our timeline, January 13th, of the conjunction of Pluto, Ceres, Saturn, and Mercury, all with the Sun, another very, very potent conjunction of 2020. We have Pluto only 1 degree from where all that all took place at 22 degrees of Capricorn, very close to the south nodes of both the south node of both Pluto and Saturn. Venus here by Antisha is right on Pluto's, 1 degree from Pluto's north node in Cancer. So again, there's a very, very strong echo, deep emphasis of this rebalancing of the Capricorn Cancer energy here. I bring the Ceres, the conjunction of January 13th in here because Ceres was very, very prominent in that chart, emphasizing, in my estimation, a return to calling on our ancestors, and the power of grieving. There are a lot of cultures that recognize the importance of grieving to bring us back and maintain a connection with our ancestors. Now again, ancestors can be anything that's open to interpretation, but really coming back into our lineage, into our past, into some sort of consistency, thread of continuity, not losing the thread of continuity, especially with all this air. It's very easy to, again, get lost in the air and the visionary qualities of things, but we need to be grounded. We need to remain grounded. So that completes my presentation, my part of this webinar. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. That's some fascinating material. I love Manilius, by the way, Andrea. I like how you were thinking about like I don't know if it's even the word re-terminologizing the words he used, because like I said, I was in the chat thing saying I've been accused of being too commanding before, and I'd like to reframe that. That would be cool. All right, so now one of the things we were talking about, and unfortunately I pulled a slide out of here that would have been, first of all, can everyone see my slides? Okay, all right. All right. Yeah, so there's 3 main circles in astrology, right? We have the ecliptic, which is really the orbit of the Earth around the sun. Now we see it as the path of the sun through the sky, right? But it's really the orbit of the Earth around the sun. That's what the ecliptic is. And then we have the equator, which is like the belt line of the Earth projected out into space. And declination is reckoned by way of the equator, and what I'm talking about, latitude, is reckoned from the ecliptic. But both of those are vertical measures, and so they're similar but different circles. Just wanted to start off with that so I can differentiate what I'm talking about here from some of what Andrea was talking about. So yeah, longitude is pretty simple. It's just east-west measurement from a starting point like 0 Aries, right? So for instance, if I say my sun is at 20 degrees of Aries, what I'm really saying is that I was born on a day where the sun was 20 degrees west of the vernal equinox. Someone who was born with the sun at 18 Cancer was born when the sun was 108 degrees west of the vernal equinox. So really the zodiac is just a stylized form of longitude. It's a lot more fun to say, I'm a ram, than to say, I was born when the sun was 20 degrees westward. Right? So yeah, so longitude is just the zodiacal position that we're used to talking about. Latitude is the vertical measurement, which has largely been ignored by the vast majority of astrologers ever since I've been on the scene, and long before, really. But it's something that we've all been into here for a while, so I just want to define terms here. Now, according to a concept called entropy, systems evolve towards their lowest energy state, right? And so the lowest energy state for our system is basically a disk. So the planets, the other planets, seem to go along the ecliptic, basically along the ecliptic, because their orbits are roughly the same as ours, but they're not the same. So they, in fact, planets are rarely ever on the ecliptic. They wander to and fro, above and below. So here's what I'm talking about. So this is that view that we were talking about, and this view is really like a top-down view. Basically, we're looking at, in this map here, what we're used to seeing is a flat disk looking from above the system, right? But if we look at it from the side, we realize that the zodiac is actually a band of sky. It's right. So this is the top-down view. This is the side-on view. So the side-on view gives us that verticality. It gives us this band where planets can be right on the ecliptic, they can be above the ecliptic, they can be below the ecliptic, right? And this is important to understand because planets, the word planet means wanderer, right? And so when we get a sense of where they are in 3 dimensions, that gives us a lot more information about who is this wanderer that we're, where are they coming from? Where are they going, you see? So this is just another little graph that's talking about the same thing, that latitude is a north-south measurement. We can also measure the latitude of stars to see, unfortunately, ephemeris, my blue Rosicrucian ephemeris has declinations but not latitudes. I really would love to find an ephemeris with latitudes on it. All right, so this is the situation in terms of the range of latitudes within this band of the zodiac, and the band is generally thought to be about 18 degrees, because Venus goes 9 degrees either way, right? So the moon is roughly about 5 degrees inclined, and so now Venus is partially a product of being so close, right? So if I stand on a soapbox and I'm 1 foot in front of you, I'm going to be sort of, well, depending on how tall you are. With Adam, I would still be shorter than him. But with someone else, I might be looming over them, right? Even though I'm only standing on a foot pedestal. But if I stand on a foot pedestal and I'm way out here where Jupiter's at, it's hardly going to make any difference, right? So that's one of the reasons why Venus has the most range here. So now we get to this idea of nodes, and planets have nodes too, right? Because a node is simply a crossing point. A node is like an intersection, right? And these intersections, just like, it's like real estate, right? They say location, location, location. this is like a crossroads, and it's the place where a planet's orbit intersects with the Earth's orbit. So this is the place where that planet's orbit is most apparent, most directly impacting the Earth. You see? So this is a big deal. And when I started noticing, I remember, I can't remember exactly who the athlete was, but I was watching the Olympics, you know, and when I'm watching sports, I'll pull up, like, I'll just find the birth date and I'll pull up charts while I'm watching. And I thought somebody had a planet somewhere and it should have been like weak. And I was like, oh my God, that planet's so strong. Why is that? And I started realizing these nodes are really important. And I started realizing why, because these crossing places with the Earth makes them more tangible. It makes them more, it's like they're in our neighborhood, right? They're on the same plane with the Earth. So this is a diagram, what I'm talking about, right? So here's the Earth's orbit with it, which is the ecliptic, and here's the crossing points. Rahu and Ketu are known as the north and south node of the moon, right? But it's the same way with the planets. They have these crossings where it's going up, and they have these crossings that's where it's going down. And here is the basic location for these. I don't know if y'all can see that very well. Blow it up a little just in case. So we have Mercury and Mars. Their nodes are located within a degree of each other, but backwards. So Mercury's south node is in Taurus. Mars's north node is there. Venus's south node is in Gemini. This is, by the way, what's driving the transit of Venus deal that we had in 2004 and 12. Venus was crossing literally at her node, which means she was right on the ecliptic, which means that's why we could see her cross the face of the sun, because she was literally right on the same plane as the Earth. And boom, there you go. You can see here Jupiter and Saturn's nodes are in Cancer and Capricorn. And so Jupiter's nodes right now are about 11 degrees of Cancer. And if you'll remember, the Uranus-Pluto squares were happening around those degrees of the cardinal signs. I think it was like back in 2013. And I wrote an article, well, a blog for the Mountain Astrologer saying, you know, I think maybe we'll finally see the economy getting a little better. And this one guy got really mad at me because he's like, you're not an economist, you don't know any of that. And well, okay, but I was right. The economy got better that year. So you know, you can see these things. And and where did the Uranus-Pluto conjunctions happen? In the 60s, in the middle degrees of Virgo, right? Which is square to the nodes of Venus. And what do we have? The summer of love. So you can really see these nodes show up. And one less fun example that, well, for some people maybe, Trump's Saturn at 24 Cancer is a really good, right? Saturn is supposed to be, we were talking about reconceptualizing dignity earlier. Saturn is supposed to be not so hot in Cancer, but when it's on its node, it's a different story. So this is like one of those examples where I was noticing, like, what's going on there? Well, it's on the plane of the Earth, and so it's definitely a different story. So how do we delineate these? According to modern astrologers like Dane Rudjar and Michael Meyer, who wrote Handbook for Humanistic Astrologers, it was basically a Rudjarian. North latitude is about the intake of energy, so it's about the personal taking on of power, right? So a person coming into their power. Whereas south latitude would be about releasing power back out into the collective. So the person exercising power in a vis-a-vis the collective. See? So we could probably use those as well for the north and south node. The north node is going to be more personally oriented, and the south node is going to be more socially or collectively oriented. And if we look, for instance, at the chart of the United States, and I tend to use a Surya Lagna or sunrise chart. So here we have Jupiter is at 5 degrees of Cancer, and that happens to correlate to the nodes move over time. And so this Jupiter was right on the ecliptic. Also Uranus was on the ecliptic, which is another story for another time, but we're talking about Jupiter and Saturn tonight. So Jupiter and Saturn are doing this also right now. All right. So we have a country that was born with Jupiter on its node, and we have Jupiter transiting on its node. That's probably going to be a meaningful transit. When you have something that's already in the natal chart and the transit comes along, you can count on that transit being eventful. This is just like a quick example of a delineation, right? So Jupiter on its north node in its exaltation, and wow, you have a country with the largest national economy of any individual country since for like 100 years. But now China's catching up. And so it's interesting with Jupiter crossing the south node that there's this talk of a trade deal with China, right? So south node being more social, collective, oriented, right? Now, the other thing about latitude that's really fascinating is that these planets wandered back and forth in terms of their relationship to the ecliptic, but they do so most radically during the retrograde. And this is why you get things happening before and after the retrograde, and people go, oh, such and such is in the shadow. Well, it's not necessarily having to do with being in some imaginary shadow. It happens to be because they're actually zooming back and forth vertically across the ecliptic. They're making very radical changes in their actual motion. And you can see that in these graphs. So this is actually what retrograde motion looks like. It's a very radical difference because during normal motion, a planet will just kind of be zooming along the ecliptic or relatively parallel to it. And then they do these weird loops, right? And so that's why we have these changes before and after retrogrades, because of the latitudinal change. So we can see here, Jupiter tends to be well below the ecliptic here in Aries, getting closer. Jupiter can cross the ecliptic in Gemini or Cancer, because remember, its node is relatively early in Cancer. Then it's above the ecliptic, north latitude in Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio. It can cross in Sag or Capricorn, below again in Aquarius and Pisces, right? So that's what this is saying. And so this shape, we're basically right about here, right? Jupiter is just direct. It's just coming out of the sun. It's going to be about 4 months before Jupiter goes retrograde. Before it gets here, which is where it goes retrograde and starts to go backwards, it's going to cross the ecliptic right about here. And so that's going to be next month. So what we're experiencing now will kind of presage events that will happen later as these more radical changes in latitude happen. And with Saturn, you can see Saturn only crosses the ecliptic in Cancer and Capricorn. Saturn is always below the ecliptic in Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Aquarius, and Pisces, and always above in Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, and Sag. And so Saturn is at the same point here in this top of this downward S-shaped loop. So it's direct, and it's going to cross the ecliptic, and then it's going to go below, and then it's going to go even further below, and then it's going to go even further below, and then it will be below for like 15 years, half of its cycle, until it gets back over to Cancer. So this is a very radical shift in motion for both of these planets, right? They're going from above to below. So now this is just a brief introduction to this whole topic, obviously, because we still want to hear from Ms. Julene. So the north-south position of planets, that's also known as latitude, is important and considerably affects our delineation. Planets that are at 0 latitude, that is on their own node, are more directly influencing the Earth plane, and therefore both more powerful and more tangible. Before, during, and after retrograde motion, planets make dramatic latitudinal shifts. This is already happening now. Saturn and Jupiter are both starting to shift southward. They're going to cross on February 13th and 25th. So next month, we'll look for, these will sort of presage events that will come to a head later during the actual retrograde, right? And it's not because of some shadow, it's because of the latitude shifting. Now, since Jupiter is on the north node for the USA, these transits are very important and usually show up in big events. 12 years ago, when Jupiter went across the south node, we had a financial downturn. Now, does that mean we're going to have another one? Not necessarily, because now we also have Saturn going across. So when I put years where we had both Saturn and Jupiter crossing the ecliptic together. The last time we had the situation we have this year was in 1960. It's a 60-year cycle for Jupiter and Saturn together. And we had big changes with civil rights. And we also had Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex. He was kind of saying this, this whole situation is getting out of hand. And then sure enough, we had the whole Bay of Pigs and the situation with Cuba and the Cold War and all that. So big social, right, South Node social collective events. And then in 1990, we had Jupiter crossing north and Saturn crossing south. That was basically when the internet was founded. So you can see that these definitely show up in big events, and it'll be interesting to see the way that it unfolds this time. Hopefully y'all will stay in touch with us throughout the season, running up to the big event in Colorado this summer. We're going to have more webinars, and we're going to have more information leading up to that event. So hopefully y'all will stay tuned, and I'll have some more to say about this. And Julene has already uncovered some really cool stuff.
Okay, so I'm going to obviously go on a little bit more about some of this, and also, comment on some of the things that Adam and Gary and Andrea have also said to kind of pull all this together here in the end. So what I wanted to show you guys here is, this is a latitude graphic ephemeris. Probably a lot of you are used to maybe seeing a declination ephemeris. Well, this is a latitude ephemeris. Notice how it only goes up to 10 here. And so as I focused on here, this is just a 3-year period of 2019 through 2021. We can see here, right, where these guys are crossing the ecliptic. So now I suppose I better explain that 0 here is the ecliptic. Just like 0 is the equator on a declination map, because remember, on the celestial latitude, we are measuring north above this line and south below this line, this 0, which is the ecliptic. Okay, so is everybody with me on looking at this graph? Because we're going to have a few of these. Yeah, you're right. You can't see this the chat as you present. Okay, so I'm hoping we have a yes from everyone. Okay, so now what I've done here is Gary had mentioned some crossings in the 60s and the 90s, and of course now. So what I wanted to show you is what this looks like as a larger cycle from the 1950s to the 2040s, right? So I kind of did a 100-year period here. And we can see that, yes, it is a 60-year cycle from here in the early 1960s decade there to the 2020s where we are now. That's a 60-year. Whereas then in between there, they cross in opposite directions. So there's a 30-year cycle of them crossing the ecliptic, but there's a 60-year pattern of whether they cross between the crossings together and the crossings opposite. So as you see what's happening in this cycle, Jupiter is the purple line, Saturn is the blue line, and they are both crossing together southward in the 60s. They are both crossing together southward now, whereas, you know, around 1990 here, Jupiter crossed north while Saturn crossed south. Okay, so I'm going to go on to my next slide, which I'm going to take this out another 100 years, you know, from the 2050s out into the 2140s, and show you that this pattern is still repeating. Here they are crossing opposite together, Jupiter to the north, Saturn to the south, and then 30 years later, they both go south together. 30 years later, Jupiter goes north, Saturn goes south. And 30 years later, they both go south together. But notice now there's getting to be a little bit of a wider period of time between what together is going to mean. That's about a month difference rather than, you know, right now where we're seeing, you know, February 13th to 25th, which, you know, is about 12 days difference. So what I have discovered as I was looking at this I had a question, is it always this way? You know, and I shoved some of these graphs I had for, you know, a couple of centuries over to Gary, and he had asked a friend who found something going in the opposite direction in the 1500s. So then what I did is I was looking at a big, huge period of time, even larger than that, and found that there are actually epochs, larger epochs that we have, where it will be like this for like 300 years, and then there's like 100 years where they don't cross together, and then there's 100 years where the exact opposite happens, another 300 where they cross together north, and then it's Saturn going north and Jupiter going south on the opposite. So there's not enough time to talk about that tonight because this isn't the actual scope of this talk, but I do definitely want to do a webinar on that for you guys because, you know, this is something that I don't think anyone else has noticed or has been talking about. So I want to thank Gary for the inspiration for this, definitely, and his friend as well. So we'll talk more about that later. But one of the things, you know, again, Gary said when these planets cross the ecliptic, they are close to their nodes, and their nodes obviously aren't the same. Just because they're crossing the ecliptic together does not mean they are conjunct. I just put the January range of these guys, so they're going to be a little bit further in February when they cross. And in case there were some people from Vedic astrology here, I have both the tropical and sidereal degrees of these signs here, and I have the Nakshatras that the ecliptic crossings are in, and where the conjunction is going to occur, because I do want to talk about some of that energy. One of the questions that showed up in the chat room, I think, was, you know, and what does this mean for humanity? And I think that when I get to the part on the Nakshatras, that's going to pose even individual questions for ourselves on what are we going to do with these seed moments here. Because these ecliptic crossings, as we can see from, you know, this diagram, are seed moments also, even though the moment isn't like at one specific time, like a conjunction. It's still a seed, a longer seed moment of their journey south together. Okay. This is also just to show the degrees and a difference. This is a 30-degree graph, which just shows how they move. And what happens in a 30-degree graph is as they go retrograde, obviously they're going to go up in the degrees. And a planet will get to the bottom, 30 degrees of a sign, technically 29, 59, and then to come right back up to 0 of the next sign, right? So we see that in January, these are the degrees of Jupiter, and then in February, it's, you know, over here, because the next column would be February. And then we can see the same for Saturn. So, and where it is in February, Saturn would be down here when it crosses in the last few degrees of Capricorn. And then here they are sidereally. In the sidereal zodiac, here's Jupiter January to February, you know, moving from like 12 to 25 degrees of Sagittarius. And Saturn is at the end of Sagittarius and moving into, you know, almost 5 Cap. So there we have that, and we have the nakshatras that Jupiter is in at while it crosses the ecliptic is Purva Ashada, and the nakshatra that Saturn is in while it crosses the ecliptic is Uttara Ashada. And these are a nakshatra pair, and I'll talk more about them here. They are a pair is that they are, their symbols are tusks of an elephant. Also, Purva Nakshatra, Purva Ashada is a fan, and Uttara Ashada is planks of a bed. Or they can be tusks of an elephant. Sometimes they have different, more than one symbol. But one of the things that I really wanted to say is that both of these nakshatras are sattvic or spiritual in nature. There's actually, when we take the nakshatras, just to back up a minute for anyone who's not familiar with the nakshatras, in Vedic astrology, there are 27 nakshatras. Each one is 13 degrees and 20 minutes long. And what happens is, as you start measuring 13 degrees and 20 minutes from 0 Aries, you will finish through 9 at, you know, 29:59 of Cancer. And then it starts over again at 0 Leo, because there's always a nakshatra that is bridging the signs, right? So for instance, since we're talking about Sagittarius here, the first nakshatra of Sagittarius goes from 0 to 1320 Sag, and that's Mula. And then Purva Ashada is going to be 1320 to 2640 of Sag. So both those first two are entirely in Sagittarius, but then Uttara Ashada comes along from 2640 Sag to 10 Cap. So this nakshatra is carrying the energy from Sagittarius to Capricorn. And there is always a nakshatra that sits at 2640 fire to 10 earth, that bridges that fire to earth sign, whether it's Aries to Taurus, whether it is Leo to Virgo, or whether it's Sag to Capricorn. And this happens at the bridge of all signs except between water and fire. There's a stop at fire because our 1320 works out evenly against 30 degrees after 4 signs. So 13 degrees and 20 minutes times 9 nakshatras equals 120 degrees or 4 signs, if you did the math. So that's where we don't have things carrying over. So there's always this repeating pattern, and that creates 3 cycles. The first cycle of nakshatras, Aries through Cancer, is Rajasic, and it's action oriented. And the second cycle from Leo to Scorpio is Tamasic, and it's more involved in the material plane. And then the last set of nakshatras from Sagittarius through Pisces is about, it's sattvic. And it's the spiritual quest. So Sagittarius is really beginning the spiritual quest. Not only do we know that anyway, if we're a Western astrologer, that's one of the interpretations of Sag, right? It's got its bow, its arrow, aimed, and it's going on this quest, whether it's, to expand our physical, spiritual, or whatever horizons we are expanding, right? There is that bow of Sagittarius. And that Sagittarius is the initiating fire sign of the spiritual quest. And the bow is very symbolic. If we see like two of Vishnu's avatars that become two main epics of India is the Mahabharata, where Vishnu's avatar is Rama. And he is often depicted with the bow. And then, of course, the other one is, I'm sorry, that was the Ramayana. And then the Mahabharata is the one with Krishna and Arjuna, who is incredible with the bow in the whole Mahabharata war. And the dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna is the Bhagavad Gita. So the bow has very important spiritual symbolism. And that's inherent in Sagittarius, which begins this last cycle of the spiritual quest. Okay, so that said, I'm going to get into these a little bit deeper in a minute because I want to end on them, but just as a bit here. So we know that they are sattvic at the primary level because all of the last 9 are. And then the first 3 of the last 9, which includes Purva and Uttara Ashada, are Rajasic or action oriented. So here we are. This isn't the spiritual thing, like the yogi just sitting there, okay? What are we doing with our spiritual quest? And when we think about it being Jupiter and Saturn that we are talking about, we are thinking about Jupiter as the quest and Saturn as the work. What work or service are we going to do? Because Jupiter has a couple names in Vedic astrology, a couple Sanskrit names. One of them is Guru, and the other one is Brihaspati. And Brihaspati was literally teacher and priest of the gods. And Saturn's name is Shani. And Shani is a servant. So what kind of service? He's a worker. What kind of work and service are we going to do? That is this spiritual in nature when Jupiter and Saturn come together. Does that make sense? That's part of every time they, combine every, 13 months, we're like on this new cycle of what kind of work are we doing to expand our knowledge, to expand our experience, to expand our wisdom, to expand our spirituality. Right? We have these 13-year cycles every time these guys come back and conjoin. This time, I think this is incredibly potent because of where the conjunction is occurring. The conjunction is going to occur in Uttara Ashada. And because before these guys conjoin, they cross the ecliptic together. So obviously, they don't cross the ecliptic together every time before each conjunction because they don't cross the ecliptic together every 13 years, right? So that's happening. And then also on top of that, of course, these planets are all getting conjoined by Pluto. We have the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and we're going to get 3 Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions as this comes in. So these planets are coming together after they have gone through the realm of Pluto. So they're really getting empowered. They're going into the depths, and we have some deep work to do with Pluto. So to talk about Purva Ashada just briefly, it's one of Venus's Nakshatras, and it's ruled by Apis, the water god. Now, Venus is the lord of the water element in Vedic astrology. It doesn't mean she rules any water signs because she does not, but she still presides over the water element. And Venus's name is Shukra, which means sea foam or sperm. And we can think of, Venus, even in Greek mythology, being born from the foam of the sea. So same idea, different culture. Uttara Ashada is one of the sun's nakshatras, and the sun, that's the natural atmakaraka, or the natural soul indicator. Okay, so this is one of our, one of the nakshatras whose aim is soul growth, right? Now, it's ruled by the Vishvadevatas, which are 10 universal gods. And all of these nakshatras possess some kind of Shakti, some feminine power. And the Shakti of Uttara Ashada, where Saturn is crossing the ecliptic and where the December conjunction occurs, is unchallengeable victory and the strength of gods and alliances. But Jupiter's mission, that we have to go through this spiritual quest here with Jupiter first in Purva Ashada before it gets to Uttara Ashada. And it has the Shakti to purify and invigorate the cosmic waters. Now, I'm going to talk about this a bit more in the end because I kind of am going to leave you guys with a question. So I'm going to come back to those. But first, I did want to show the charts of these conjunctions. So I have on the left here, I have the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the tropical zodiac with whole sign houses. And I have the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the sidereal zodiac in the diamond North Indian Vedic chart over here. So no matter which zodiac, which way we slice it, this is occurring in Saturn's sign, whether it's at 0 degrees and 29 minutes of Aquarius tropically, or 6 degrees and 20 minutes in Capricorn Vedically, sidereally, and this UAS is Uttara Ashada right above there. And this is where the 10th house is in this diamond chart. The first one is up here with Aries, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So all the angles are in the middle diamond. Okay, so one of the interesting things is, because I do both astrologies, and we are who we are, going through what we're going through, no matter which lens of the zodiac we're going to decide to look at ourselves through. Okay, we might get at things in different ways because the charts look entirely different, but there are certain things that pop up as being powerful both times. Okay, for instance, if we decide to look at the dignities in this chart, of course Saturn is rocking a lot of dignity points. He's in his own sign of Aquarius. Mars happens to also be and have a ton of dignity over here in Aries, right? So we see a strong Mars. If we look at these parallels, which is declination, not latitude, Venus is parallel to the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, right? And Andrea had mentioned a lot of how important Venus was, and the feminine story, that was unfolding here out of this cycle. So we are seeing a strong Venus and a strong Mars in this chart, just off the bat without saying anything else. Now, when we come to this chart and we go, oh, geez, well, here's Mars in Pisces, here's Venus in Scorpio. How on earth are those strong in those positions? How could they be strong in both places? Well, they actually happen to be, because Mars happens to also be in the same sign in the Navamsa. So when a planet is in the same sign in the natal Rashi, they call it, chart, for the sign chart, whole sign chart, when it's in the same sign, not the same house, the same sign, Mars in Pisces in that conjunction chart, the birth chart seed moment of this next Jupiter-Saturn cycle, and it's also in the Navamsa of Pisces. That means it's Varkodama, and that means it's very auspicious. The same thing happens with Venus. Venus is in the Navamsa of Scorpio as well as the sign of Scorpio. This is similar to, if you guys are familiar with the decans, where like the first 10 degrees of Aries is Aries, and then the second 10 of Aries has a subflavor of Leo, right? So if a planet was in Aries in the first 10 degrees of Aries, it would also be in the decan of Aries. This is the same thing with the Navamsa, but the division is 3 degrees and 20 minutes instead of 10. Okay? So both of those planets are showing up very powerful in this chart, even though we've used two different systems. And whenever that happens, I do kind of like to point that out, because a lot of people, it's just nice to see that they both work and they both can say similar things. Okay, so I want to come back to these nakshatras real quick because I want to leave you with a question. And one of the things that I want to say here real quick is that the whole purpose of the nakshatras is to aid us with spiritual evolution. Brahma actually asked Daksha Prajapati, the great cosmic progenitor, to aid him with the universal process of spiritual evolution. So Prajapati married his 27 daughters to the moon, and these are the 27 nakshatras. And they all have spiritual aims, and they all have Shakti powers. Now, when we break the nakshatra down into its roots, we get to attain or approach here. So the nakshatras are a way of communing with the gods, a way to approach them. The gods that preside over the nakshatras, these are their mansions as well. And Adam began his talk this evening mentioning about communion with the sky. So the nakshatras are one of the ways to do that. Now, I talked about the first three nakshatras of Sag, and our very, in the last 9, the first 3 of the last 9. And how that they are sattvic or spiritual on the primary level, and then rajasic on the secondary level, which means action. And that rajasic energy, this tends to bring out spiritual warrior energy, each in their own way. So the first one is Mula. Now, these planets aren't in Mula now, but they were in Mula. And K2 just yesterday, mean south node K2, went into Mula just yesterday. So in Mula, Mula means root. And in that nakshatra, we realize that we must destroy the root of our illusions, doubt, negativity, material desires, and all things that keep us trapped in the repetitive karmic cycles and our low egoic natures. Mula is actually a K2 nakshatra. So it's karmic past patterns, right? So this is about getting rid of those past patterns, destroying them at the roots that lead us off course of our dharmic path. And Adam talked a ton in the beginning in his about the dharmic path. And I wrote notes over here. I was going to say something. I was going to repeat something that Adam said that was so cool. And now I'm not even finding it. So I guess it's because I'm supposed to hurry and go through. But Adam, but he had mentioned all that about, the dharmic path and how important that is. And that is what this is about. Jupiter is a dharmic planet. Saturn is a karmic planet, and Jupiter is a dharmic planet. So what is the dharma that we're doing here with our karmas, right? This is like the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So, so one of the things we want to make sure we're doing before we work with the Purva Ashada and Uttara Ashada energy is that we have to understand which things are at the roots that need to be destroyed so that we can have the fertile ground. It's kind of like when you plant a garden. You can't plant a garden where there's a whole bunch of other plants or weeds or things. You've got to pull it up so you have fertile ground to plant your garden. And the other thing about Mula being a root, it's not just about destroying the things at the root. It's also about having a strong foundation and a strong root, to be rooted, to be grounded in who you are and where you are and what you are doing, as well as releasing the roots of the past that are no longer serving you going forward. And I know that was something very similar to something Adam had said in the beginning about the Dharma going forward. So in Purva Ashada, where Jupiter is currently placed, we are filled with new possibilities of what we can create in this fertile ground, right, having gone through Mula. And we uncover new spiritual knowledge. It becomes part of us as the wisdom of Sagittarius. And remember, this is the one with the elephant tusk. And a lot of times, unfortunately, people hunt elephants or they take their tusks. Well, the tusks can grow back. So this is knowledge that we have that can't be lost. Even if someone tries to take away our spiritual knowledge, they can't. So the Shakti power of Purva Ashada is to purify and invigorate the cosmic waters. It's a Venus nakshatra. And because it's a Venus nakshatra, there is a lot of creativity here. That's why we're filled with these new possibilities of what we can create and what we can do. And as Jupiter is crossing the ecliptic, it's the apparent sun's path in our sky, even though it's actually the path of the earth around the sun, but it's still that earth-sun connection. That's our consciousness of our soul mission here on earth, which again is our dharma. You know, that's what the ecliptic in a sense is, a path of. And especially when things cross there, it can trigger dharmic impulses. So Jupiter's asking us to become conscious of our creative and spiritual potentials, to cleanse and purify ourselves, our body, and in mind, to embark on the next cycle of our spiritual quest. It's crossing north. So how does that relate to the intake of our personal dharmic mission? And now Uttara Ashada, where Saturn is placed crossing the ecliptic and where the conjunction occurs, actually has like 1/4 in Sag and 3/4 in Capricorn, and the conjunctions in the Capricorn segment. So we're going to hear a lot more Saturn here, especially when we think of the symbol of this as planks of a bed. You know, do you just want to sleep on a wooden bed of planks? Not necessarily, but we've just left the realm of Venus's nakshatra, right? And we've also left the sign of nice cushy Jupiter. So we've left behind the area that is connected with the two benefic Venus and Jupiter that want to give us all these lush and lavish and luxurious things. And, you know, we're now doing a Sun Saturn thing, and it's a little more stark. So as this happens, and what we have here is, if we are willing to, you know, do some type of sacrifice, to let go of the things that are no longer serving us, or whatever that means to us, and answer the call to Dharma in our hero's journey of the spiritual quest, we have the support of these 10 universal gods that, you know, that are there for us to aid us on our own hero's journey. If you will say, anytime we see the sun, it is kind of like a hero's journey, right? So at this higher Uttara level, right? Purva is earlier, Uttara is later. Purva is lower, Uttara is higher. You know, that's how the translation goes. So now what we're coming into in here is dharmic responsibility, because we have Saturn here. And that's what Adam mentioned. I found my note. Adam mentioned how our dharma may challenge us, and it may not be comfortable at first. And how fitting is that for this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Uttara Ashada, where, you know, one of the symbols is just like this bed of planks. You know, but yet he also mentioned that Jupiter is consciousness, and it's expanding its efforts to interact and understand more of its reality physically, psychologically, and spiritually. And I wrote that exactly as he had it on his slide, because I totally agreed with this. And I think in these nakshatras of Sagittarius, we actually hear that. So the question that I want to say one more thing, that this Saturn Jupiter, there's a lot of pushing through the limitations of Saturn, but there's also all the possibilities that are unfolding of Jupiter, right? Here's all the possibilities. Push through the limitations. And then what work or service Saturn are you called to with your dharmic mission, Jupiter, through these new perspectives? So the question that I want to leave you with is, basically, sitting with these energies, especially Uttara Ashada, what personal message emerges for you? Kind of sit with that in a purified state of consciousness before you think about all the houses and planets in your chart. Meditate on that with your mind as a blank slate. You know, look within as these planets cross the ecliptic together. And that's what I wanted to leave you with.